maybe we could touch on testosterone prior to HRT as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, blood seems to be the best one in LCMS
Yeah.
assay.
This is the big
Mhm.
area where we as urine testers have to be sort of open-handed about the fact that there's a weakness to urine testing that there's a long nerdy story there that we can tell, but it doesn't correlate to serum um, as much as well as estradiol and progesterone for reasons that have to do with biology and excretion and urine and that sort of thing.
Right.
But leaning into serum for testosterone, both with and without therapy, I think
Mhm.
should be considered the gold standard. And the urine test, so the way we word it is that for estrogen and progesterone, the Dutch test is a really nice primary, like first like attack.
Mhm.
You can use it by itself.
Yeah.
But with testosterone, it becomes more of a complementary product of hanging your hat on a serum test and
Yeah.
then using Dutch to see how is it metabolized, how does it turn into estrogen, how is the estrogen
Mhm.
metabolized. Really powerful tool. But if you're using it in isolation, you're going to have some issues, and that's where we again just have to be
Mhm.
honest about the limitations. The other nice thing about Dutch is that particularly for men, if you're
Mhm.
trying to solve the testosterone issue and you have no window into the stress response and the HPA axis,
Right.
it's going to be really difficult because there's a lot of overlap between a stressed out, anxious guy and a
Mhm.
low T guy, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's where what I mean. It becomes a really nice complementary product, but again, you don't want to use it by
Mhm.
itself in isolation for testosterone.
Mhm. Okay. And just sticking with testosterone, I did want to ask you a couple of follow-ups. One was about how you see urine testing being superior in the certain genetic SNPs that occur as it pertains to testosterone. I know Dr. Saltiel has spoken about this. Is something that would be helpful for the audience to know. Is that something you can expound on?
So the issue there is highlighted in people from Southeast Asia, and that
Mhm.
is this, that we don't test for estrogen or testosterone. We don't test those hormones in the urine. We test their water soluble conjugates. So
Yeah.
you go testosterone, your body says, I can't get rid of this in a water soluble form unless I add a glucuronide or a sulfate form. So now it's got a little sugar moiety or something like that on it. Now, only the bioavailable
Mhm.
free fraction is free for that conjugation. So, in that sense, conceptually, what's in your urine is a nice reflection of what's bioavailable,
Mhm.
but it is dependent upon the proper conjugation process.
Correct.
And for testosterone, there's a specific enzyme that conjugates testosterone and a couple of its metabolites. But if you
Mhm.
go any further away from testosterone, estrogen, even a lot of the other testosterone metabolites, it's a different enzyme that conjugates it so that it can be in urine. And it just so happens that that enzyme for testosterone
Mhm.
conjugation, there's a genetic variant that renders it ineffective. Now, when you start saying like genetic variant, you think of like clinical things
Mhm.
going on. There's not really a strong association with
Right.
anything clinically dysfunctional about this. It just means testosterone has to find a different way to get excreted
Mhm.
into the urine. So what you end up with is so this variant is very prevalent in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So if you compare 20 men from China or women and 20
Mhm.
men from Caucasian men from wherever, you're going to find that there's a serum correlation that's pretty strong in the non Southeast Asian group,
Mhm.
and that in the Southeast Asian group, you're going to find serum not correlating, and it's sort of urine's fault. Like the
Mhm.
urine is
Yeah.
underrepresenting what's going on, and that genetic variant is like prevalent like 2/3 of people
Mhm.
from China, as an example, but also obviously, as you spread out from the globe, I don't know where that stops exactly,
Right.
but in, for example, the Caucasian population, it's only like 2%, right?
Mhm.
So for
Okay.
us, we have looked at that really carefully, and so we can find patterns in your urine to say it's likely that your urine is probably a false
Mhm.
negative in terms of what's going on with your testosterone. What's the suggestion then? Go do a blood test. So that's and how that relates to genetic testing, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. It's
Right. Mhm.
UGT2B17. That's the
Yeah.
enzyme. Um, and it's just a weakness of urine testing that we have to compensate for by the other things that we measure
Mhm.
and by complementing what we do with a serum testosterone test and put the two together to get,
Mhm.
really optimal understanding of what's going on with testosterone.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to ask you about testosterone is this interesting interplay between testing testosterone in men and how that's recommended by all the major medical societies,
Right.
and then when it comes to women, where ACOG and NAMS by and large recommend against testing. And so I want to just maybe have your thoughts on that about the clinical validity of testing
Right.
testosterone in women and how that correlates to symptoms.
Yeah, when we went through our HRT course, which we're just now like editing and that sort of thing, we had this sort of idea of like concentric circles of knowledge of starting with simple stuff
Yeah.
and then building out to the more complex. And when we got to simple, we included testosterone therapy. And then
Yeah.
as we dug into it, we went, you know what, this is
Yeah.
really important, but
Right.
it's by no means simple.
Right.
And the reason for that, I think, is because there's so much endocrinology going on, meaning
Mhm.
intracellular stuff that happens. For example, DHT is a good example of how you can explain this. If you think about DHT, it's a metabolite of
Mhm.
testosterone. It's 3 times as potent. So if
Yeah.
you get DHT in the cell and it hits those androgen receptors, it's very potent. That's why if you're a woman and you make DHT, you're going to get hair where you don't want it, acne, losing your hair, that sort of thing. But when you look at the science of it,
Mhm.
measuring DHT is actually not the best way to
Mhm.
measure DHT. What happens is testosterone goes into the cell.
Mhm.
In that cell, it turns into DHT. Now it's really potent. It hits the androgen receptor, and then in that same cell, it gets turned into androstenediol, which is one of the
Mhm.
metabolites we have on our panel. So
Mhm.
that thing itself is not androgenic, but it is a representation of
Mhm.
intracellular DHT production.
Right.
And so what's going on at the receptor level with testosterone and its metabolites is not simple. So just measuring testosterone that happens to be cruising around in your veins,
Mhm.
in your blood, or even DHT is not the whole picture. It's
Yeah.
really complex. So there are a number of studies that I've read that have broken this down in certain
Mhm.
populations. I just read one yesterday where they were
Mhm.
looking at kids, and what they found is free testosterone in blood correlated with these non-testosterone metabolites in urine because they represent essentially the reservoir of substrate that you can make testosterone from intracellularly. And it's just a complex story. So,
Yeah.
all that to say, they have
Mhm.
not directly linked a particular testosterone measurement
Mhm.
with clinical outcomes in a meaningful way to where it can be a paint by numbers scenario like it is with men. If your testosterone is below a certain point, it
Mhm.
means something. But
Yeah.
in women, it's testosterone, it's the
Mhm.
precursors, it's how much do you make DHT. So there's
Right.
this three-dimensional story going on. And when you look at a Dutch test,
Mhm.
especially in conjunction with serum, you get a story,
Yeah.
but it's not simple. And I think what a group like that you mentioned, I think it was the North American Menopause Society, but
Mhm.
those types of groups are really trying to create paint by numbers stories for people
Mhm.
that they can follow. And that's really good because it simplifies it and you can draw conclusions
Yeah.
from the numbers that you have. That story is just not that simple. So we feel like if you look at the breadth of what we offer
Mhm.
with a serum testosterone, with SHBG, and you put this whole story together,
Yeah.
you can really characterize a woman well as it relates to those hormones.
Mhm.
Um, but it's never going to be a simple, if this is below this, here's your treatment option. It's
Mhm.
just more complex than that.